I know some people will, join in, but we want to get started. So, I know a lot about grants, but I tell everybody I know, if you're writing a resubmission, talk to Tom Cunningham, because we need to get him the wizard sorting hat and a wand, Gryffindor outfit. He's just really good at helping you write that introduction, which is really tricky, to make it just match and sound like you have addressed everything that they didn't like, etc. So, and Tom gets better and better at kind of making this hopefully more and more clear of how to have that winning resubmission. So with that, our associate VPR will be talking about resubmitting for success. Take it away, Tom.
Thank you for that very interesting introduction. Yeah. So what I'm going to talk about today is going to be focused mostly on NIH grants, but you can apply this to any federal grant, any intramural seed grant program, any grant where you've gotten feedback and you're going to resubmit it. And so this is a process that can be difficult because we don't get a lot of practice at it. We get more practice revising and resubmitting manuscripts than a lot of us do with grants. And early in your career, I think it's good to reach out to people who've had experience with this so they can help you along with it. And so what we're talking about today is going to be resubmitting applications and trying to make them more competitive as part of the resubmission process. And so why would you think about resubmitting a grant if it didn't get funded? So the numbers for 2021 is that success for a first-time grant submission. And so this is for all research project grants, all R's, all U's, all P's is 14%. But the success rate for a resubmission more than doubles to 31%. And so that means going through this process and being able to address the comments that the reviewers get can lead you to a really competitive grant application that can get you funded. So NIH strongly encourages you to resubmit. So do most other funding agencies. NIH has a lot of examples of how to write and prepare a resubmission online. And they also have a video of a panel discussion about creating resubmissions for SBIRs. So there's a lot of resources out there that you can use to try to make the grant competitive after you get the feedback from your study section. And so NIH has a real specific policy on resubmissions. You're only allowed a single resubmission of original application. Original application is usually called an A0, and the resubmission is labeled an A1. Back in the day when I was an early career investigator, you actually used to get 2 chances to resubmit. So you'd have an A0, an A1, and then an A2. Some of the older reviewers like me still tend to use this kind of language, and we'll get back to this when we talk about resubmitting later. So following an unsuccessful resubmission in A1, your application is going to be considered a new application, even if you use the same title and it's the same ideas, and you just make a few revisions and resubmit it. This A0 could go back to the original study section that looked at it and the original reviewers who had problems with your A1. So you want to think about that before you resubmit a revised application as a new A0. So foreign resubmission to count as an A1, you have to submit it within 37 months of the original A0 application. So if you have a lot of experiments that you need to do and you've got a lot of feedback from the study section, you don't have to try to turn around and submit it at the next cycle. Sometimes that can even be a bad idea, depending on how much new data or new experiments the study section requested. So the requirements for a resubmission are pretty straightforward. So the most important piece that we're going to talk about today is an introduction. So this is a summary of all the substantial changes that you made to the grant, things that you took out, new experiments that you did, anything that you did to try to address their concerns. And you have to do this in a single page unless the instructions for your specific funding application say otherwise. And so writing this is almost as important and maybe more important for your resubmission than writing your specific aims page. And that's because when your grant is discussed around the table, study section members are going to pull up and look at your specific aims page, and they're also going to look at your introduction. So you want your introduction and your specific aims page to be really clear and easy to understand in case other voting members of the committee pull it up and look at it. And you also want to make sure that it's really clear in case your grant application is assigned to some new reviewers, so they can easily understand why you did what you did to address the concerns that were raised in the previous review. Okay. So to write this introduction, what you have to do is sit down and read the summary statement that you get back from the study section. And for NIH, usually you get a series of scores for each part of the grant, like the significance, the investigator, innovation, approach, and environment, and then an overall score. If your grant was scored and it was discussed during the study section, you've written a really good grant. Usually the cutoff for discussion at an NIH study section requires a pretty good score to begin with. I know when I was on study section, the cutoff values ranged anywhere from 2.5 to 4. So to make it past that initial cut and be discussed, you have to write a really good grant. So if you got scored, congratulations. So if you didn't get funded, what you're going to do now is you're going to sift through the summary statement and you're going to look at the numbers for each section and try to see which parts of the grants the reviewers had the most problem with. If your grant was discussed, at the top of the summary statement will be a summary of the study section's discussion of your grant. What happens is, as your grant is discussed, the chair and the SRO take notes, and then the information about this discussion gets summarized and included in the summary statement above the scores of the individual reviewers. What's important about this is a lot of times what's discussed are the things that are the biggest issue and the most important points that you need to discuss and address in your revision. And so you want to take, the first thing you want to do is look at the discussion and see what things are listed in there, because those are probably going to be the most important things for you to discuss. The next thing you're going to do is go through the rest of the summary statement and look at the criticisms from each of the individual reviewers. And so what you're going to look for are common criticisms, things that they all had issues with. And then you're also going to look for disagreements among the reviewers, things that some of the reviewers didn't have a problem with, or maybe thought was a strength of the application, but another reviewer took exception to. So you're going to want to be able to talk about these disagreements and be able to address them as you prepare your application and write your introduction. The other thing you need to be aware of is that your score and your percentile might look worse than what you read in the reviews. A lot of times what will happen is you'll need to get that 2.5 or that 3 to get discussed. But during the discussion of the applications, the reviewers are going to be encouraged, sometimes very strongly encouraged, to spread the scores out again to protect the percentiles so that there isn't score compression and that they can get as many applications funded as they possibly can. So during this discussion, it might end up with you receiving a worse score than your original score. And the reviewers might not go back and edit their comments to reflect this new higher or worse priority score. And so if there is some kind of disagreement there, and it looks like the comments weren't as bad as the score you received, just focus on the comments and address them, and don't really worry about what the score was if you were discussed. Another thing that you should strongly think about is contacting your program officer. When your grant is sent to CSR and it's an ERA Commons, you're assigned a study section, and that's the person and the review panel that are going to review your grant, and they're part of the Center of Scientific Review. But then you're going to be assigned an institute who's actually going to fund your grant for you if you get a fundable score. In that institute is going to be a program officer who's going to watch and kind of shepherd your grant through the review process. And when it comes time for it to go to council, if it receives a score, that's the person who's going to let you know that you're funded. It's not uncommon for program officers to attend study section meetings if they know one of their grants is possibly going to be discussed. If they're there, then they actually listen to the discussion and heard the reviewers come to their final decision and their final score. This can be an opportunity for you to try to figure out how to address some of the reviewers' comments, especially if they make statements that look like they didn't agree with each other, or there are conflicting statements in the reviews. Not all program officers attend study section. And so before you ask that program officer for advice, you might first contact and ask them if they attended the study section. A lot of times the SROs will record the study section, and if the program officer has time, they could go back and listen to the recording. So depending on how collaborative your program officer is, they might be willing to go back and do that for you. So if you don't get funded, your program officer could be a good source of information about how to help craft your revision and your introduction. The other thing you should consider doing, no matter how painful it is let other people see the summary statement. I don't know about y'all, but a lot of times when I first get a summary statement back, it can be kind of an emotional experience because you've worked really hard to create your grant and you think that your science is good, otherwise you wouldn't submit it. So getting criticized, especially if you don't think the criticisms were fair, can be pretty hard to receive. Your friends can help you with that and provide some feedback so that you can get some perspective on the comments and be able to address them. And also, if you have collaborators who are co-investigators on the grant, you actually kind of owe it to them to let them see the summary statement so they know better how to help you generate ideas and things that'll help with the revision. And as you go through it, you want to see if they see the same things that you do. If the most important things to address are the things that you're focused on, so that you can really craft a good proposal and revision. So the other thing that can happen when you submit a grant is that it doesn't get discussed. This is called streamlined or triaged. And if this happens to you, well, welcome to the club. This is a tough funding environment, and all of us have submitted grants that no matter how good we thought they were, didn't get discussed. And so it can be really hard to know what to do with a streamlined grant because you don't have the benefit of a discussion that's part of your summary statement, and you don't have the feedback from the reviewers discussing and coming to some kind of consensus about your grant. So all you're going to have are their written reviews. So when this happens, what you need to do is kind of treat your summary statement the same way. Go and look at the scores for each of the sections, look for common criticisms, and look for disagreements among the reviewers. And then there are some specific sections that you need to be mindful of in terms of whether or not you got a high score on that. If you got a really high score for significance of or innovation, it could be really hard for you to try to convince the study section that your grant is worthy. And if you have really high scores on these sections, it could potentially be a lot harder to address than if you got really high scores in things like your approach. Also, if you have high scores for the investigator or the environment, it might take you longer to address criticisms on those sections of the grant than it would be for criticisms related to the approach. So one of the important things that my SRO for my study section used to let people know was what the cutoff was for discussion. If the cutoff was 2.5 and you had a 3, that means you had a really good grant, and you probably want to go ahead and consider revising it and resubmitting it based on your scores. If you had much higher numbers, things in the range of 5 or higher, then it's going to be a lot harder for you to make up enough ground to get funded with a single resubmission. Not that it's never happened before, but it's a lot harder to do. And so if you have higher numbers, then you might want to consider not resubmitting this specific application, but starting over again with some parts of it and creating another proposal. Another thing to consider is whether or not your grant was assigned to the right study section. Some study sections, so the way study sections are set up today, after they've combined a lot of them, is that there's more than one scientific constituency in every study section. The one I was chair of, when they assigned members, they thought about 7 different parts of the field and tried to find experts in 7 different areas to populate the study section. Because the size of the study section was limited, that meant that the chances you were going to get 3 people who were in your exact area was pretty slim. And so that means that you were probably going to have a non-expert review your grant. Depending on the study section makeup and how diverse the study section is, you might want to consider looking at the CSR webpage and finding another study section that has members who are more aligned to better understand your grant proposal. If you are going to go try to get into another study section, you're better off starting over again and retooling your grant for this other study section, and maybe not necessarily considering a revision. Okay, so the big question you have to ask yourself when you're going to decide whether you're going to resubmit or submit a new application is, are the problems that the reviewers had with your grant fixable or not? So you want to figure out what the positives are in the study section. In the summary statement, you want to see if they want specific pilot data or experiments that you didn't have. And you want to look and see which of the criteria received the worst scores. Typically, it's a lot easier to fix criticisms about your scientific approach that might involve adding additional data, changing the design of experiments, versus criticisms associated with the significance. If the reviewers don't think the area that you're trying to study is significant, it can be really hard to come up with examples from the literature or clinical data to try to elevate the significance. The other thing you want to try to gauge is, especially if you're discussed, is whether the summary says there was high or low enthusiasm for your grant. If they said there was high enthusiasm, but they had some problems with the approach, then it could be not necessarily easy, but easier to fix a grant like that than one where they said there was low enthusiasm and you had high scores spread across all the criticisms. And then you also want to, again, consider whether or not you might want to go to another study section if you are going to generate a new application. And another thing that you might want to think about is whether you might even consider changing mechanisms. If you put in a very innovative technique that you don't have a lot of pilot grant for or experience with, some study section members can use that against you and use that as a way to not only ding you for approach, but also for innovation as well. While I was on study section, what tended to happen was when people were proposing new things like single cell RNA-seq, and they didn't have a lot of data to do that, their R01 wouldn't get funded, but then the next cycle or two, that part of that R01 would come back as an R03 or an R21 designed to collect the preliminary data that was missing in the original R01 application. And then, if the R21 was funded, you'd eventually see the R01 again with the new data, and it would be a lot more competitive. And so if there are specific pieces you might want that they have problems with, or if you do need a lot of additional experiments, you might want to consider using an R03 or an R21 mechanism to try to get that pilot data. The other thing you can do is try to look and see if there are internal funding programs that allow you to do that as well. And we can talk about that a little bit later. So when it comes time for you to write your introduction, after you've revised your grant, there are a couple of things that you can do to try to maximize its impact. Again, you want to talk to the program officer, and if they attended the study section, you want to make sure that you're addressing all the concerns that were most serious to the study section. You also want to try to maximize the available space, but not make it so dense that it looks really unapproachable to the reviewers. If you have a lot of things to address, you might not want to waste space on praising the reviewers or listing things that they saw as strengths of the application. If you have a shorter laundry list of things to fix and you have space for it, then you can try to remind them that they actually thought it was a good grant and try to get them to not focus on the negatives. And then you want to focus on the 5 core areas that they use to review your grant and make sure that you address all of the significant issues that they had with each part of the review. And another tip would be to try to make your response proportional to the importance of the weakness. If all of the reviewers agreed that one part of your approach was a significant problem to your grant, and only one of them had a concern about another part of it, you want to spend more time and space addressing the serious concern than you would a concern raised by a single reviewer. The other final thing that I really want to encourage you to do is ask your colleagues who've gone through this process before to look at it for you. Their feedback and their experience can help you see things that you don't see and appreciate differences that you might not think are important and help you improve it. Kind of as I said before, given the way study sections are made up and given the way study sections are run, it wouldn't be uncommon for everybody on the study section to open up your introduction and your specific aims page while your grant is being discussed. And so being able to have these parts of the grant readily understandable to non-experts of the field can be really important to get the kind of enthusiasm that you want, right? If it is real hard to understand and it isn't clear, that can be used by reviewers who weren't assigned the grant to question the good scores and to try to pull things down for them to protect their own grants. So it's really important that your introduction and your specific aims page be easy to read. And the best way to make sure it is to ask your colleagues to take a look at it for you to make sure that they understand. So the other most important thing that you don't want to do, try not to get defensive or take it personally. I know that's easier to say than it is to do, but this is a criticism of your work. It's not really a criticism of you, even if they ding you on your investigator piece. For me, it's always easier for me to address their comments if I don't take it personally and I don't get defensive. So what I mean when I say that is don't tell them that they're wrong explicitly, especially if they were. You have to decide, do you want to be right or do you want to get funded, right? And so when push comes to shove, I'd rather be funded, right? There's this balance of, aggression and supplication that you want to have to make sure you get this through. And you want to make sure that you measure your responses so they won't be read as defensive by the reviewers or other people in the study section. The other thing you want to try not to do is to explicitly disagree with your reviewers. If you do disagree with them, you don't want to make it personal. You want to focus on the science and you want to express to them why you're doing what you're doing, and you want to justify it scientifically. The other thing that can be kind of problematic is to use costs or logistics to avoid addressing a problem that the reviewers had. If they think something is a serious problem and you tell them that you can't afford to fix it, they're going to think you're being defensive and you're not responding in good faith, even if there's a grain of truth to it. You can always revise the experiments and revise the budget to try to make sure you address their most pressing concerns. And so just to summarize, no matter how bad it reads, no matter how personal it is, don't take it personally. Okay. And so here are some examples of some responses that studies section reviewers might consider defensive. So if they say you missed something and you write and you respond, we already included age as a matching criteria as noted as page 18 of the original application, they might consider that to be a little brusque. A tempered response might be, we apologize for our lack of clarity in describing the study design. We will include age as a matching criteria. Specifically, cases and controls will be matched on age, and you cite the section. No matter how frustrated you are, try not to show it and try to be somewhat deferential. It's one of those situations where even if you think it was clear, if they didn't understand it, whether it's fair or not, the responsibility goes to you to make sure that they do understand it so you can get a good score and get funded. Another of examples of some responses that aren't defensive are listed here, right? So here, response to reviewer 1 recommended the addition of a 6-month follow-up study. And the response, we choose not to conduct a follow-up study as our primary focus in this application because our focus was to determine whether the intervention could be effective in real time. Another way to address this that will sound less defensive and maybe more deferential would be the reviewer raises an important point. Therefore, we have added a 3-month post-intervention focus group that will assess whether the family continues to dance together, how often, and what format. We are unable to follow the participants for 6 months due to the fact that recruitment is rolling over the first 2 years of the grant, leaving insufficient time to follow the last cohort. So that's more logical, it's less defensive, and it gives a good justification for why you're not giving them what they want. And so another important point to writing the introduction is to organize it. This organization should make it easier for a new reviewer or somebody who's in the study section looking at the introduction to follow it and figure out what you've done and why you've done it. You also want to refer to new publications, new figures, and new data that you've produced or added to the application as well. And so the way you organize it really doesn't matter, but you need to have it organized. And so the next couple of slides are examples of how to maybe organize an introduction. So we have a lot of practice doing this for journal articles. And a lot of times in journal articles, what we tend to do is we go through the reviewers and we list the points in the order that they occur. That's not always the best way to organize a summary statement, because you don't have an unlimited amount of space like you do when you revise and provide a response to a review of a journal article. You have to fit it all on one page, and the best way to do it is to come up with an organization that makes sense depending on what kind of criticisms you got. And so one way to do it is to organize it by the review criteria. This has an introduction, then it goes through the significance, investigator, innovation, and approach, right? And so if you use this type of organization, you can effectively skip sections that weren't heavily criticized and focus on the areas that received the most criticism. Another way to do it would be to organize it according to themes. If the summary statement broke down into really easy to identify areas that you can put together and address, you might consider doing that. This talks about productivity, key preliminary data, and then at the end, it addresses individual points that weren't shared by all the reviewers or addressed in the previous part of the introduction. Some organize it according to reviewer. This can be a good way to organize your introduction if most of the criticisms were given to you by 1 or 2 reviewers, and the other 2 reviewers didn't have as many issues with the grant. And this is another version organized by key points. And so, when you resubmit this application, it's going to go back to the study section. And these days, they're all presented in a random order based on career stage, then funding mechanism. So back in the old days, they used to do it in order of priority score. But now it's probably going to be given at some point during the review, and the reviewers won't know when it will be discussed until they show up at study section. As I said before, chances are you might not get the same reviewers. It's not as bad as it used to be at NIH when they used to let people take 6-year terms as opposed to 4-year terms. But SROs tend to add ad hoc members depending on what the portfolio looks like for that given cycle. And so if you had an ad hoc before, you might not get the same reviewer because that person won't be on the study section for the next discussion of your grant. One of the problems that can happen if you don't get the same reviewers is that a new reviewer might try to bring up new issues related to it, and that could hurt your ability to get funded. Hopefully, the reviewers who did get it will try to be able to help out and try to stick to things that were raised in the previous review. The other thing is that your A1 will be discussed as a revision. All the reviewers will get your summary statements from the previous submission, and they'll be able to try to determine independently whether they think you did a good job of addressing the study section's previous concerns. And so you want to definitely make sure that you do the best job you can revising and writing your introduction. And then how you responded to the previous reviews will be one of the points of discussion. I don't think I'm breaking confidentiality by saying it's not uncommon for a previous reviewer, if they're the first reviewer, to start off by saying, I think this person did a good job, or I think this person didn't listen to us at all, right? And so that can be part of the discussion, and that can determine how your grant is going to be scored, how well you responded. And then another kind of thing that's specific to NIH grants is that if you've submitted an A0 and an A1 and those didn't get funded, and you revise the A1, and it goes back to the same study section, it's going to be considered an A0, even though people in the study section have seen it before. They're going to be discouraged from saying that they've seen it before, because NIH thinks it could be prejudicial to people who haven't seen it before to know that it's been around for a while. Even though it's going to be treated as an A0, you still need to fix the issues that were identified in the A1. Even though they're not allowed to say that they saw it before, if you get some of the same reviewers, they're going to know whether or not you did a good job and you took of addressing their concerns, and whether or not you took them seriously. And the last thing you want to do is have one of your old reviewers get it and feel that you didn't take their concerns seriously at all. And so that's all the points and tips that I wanted to share today. If you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to answer those. And then just one final thing is we do have a bridge grant program that's designed for people who have received a summary statement but need funds and support to do additional experiments to make a credible revision and introduction. This is listed on the REAP webpage. And so if you're in a situation where you're going from an A0 to an A1 and you feel like you're out of money and you need help and support to get the preliminary data you need to make a competitive application, we've got a program that can help you with that. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Dr. Gregory.
So questions, comments? I mean, I know as a reviewer, when I read a resubmission, the first thing I look at is that introduction and the summary statement from before. Did they actually make any attempt to respond to the reviewers? And if not, I'm not happy. Shirley.
Yes, I think one of the challenges we face now, Tom and the rest of you, Paula, is this change to the one-page introduction response, especially when you get a whole lot of suggestions from the reviewers. When they approach things like investigator or institution, those are things that can be addressed rather easily. But if you've got 3 reviewers that all have issues with approach, and those approach issues may not be the same issues, how do you suggest that we prioritize which ones of those? Because, you know, maybe one reviewer gets all their answers and the other one's like, well, they didn't address my issue of approach.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And that's something you have to take some time to sift through. So, and if your PO went and listened to the discussion and you were discussed, you can get some help there to find out, which one of those issues are the most serious, right? Or you can use the discussion to help prioritize how you're going to write your introduction into your revision. Usually the things that get discussed are the things that everybody feels the most strongly about, whether they agree about it or not, right? And so, if you get discussed, it's a lot easier. If you don't get discussed, then that's where you probably need to have another set of eyes help you do it, to try to read the tea leaves, to see what maybe are the most serious things that you need to address, right? And then, in that situation, and you have a lot of things set up for the approach, then I'd organize it so the approach is the first thing that I address, and I use as much space as I need to deal with those things, right? To make sure that I've addressed their concerns as best you can. And then you can move on to some of the other pieces, right? And then if you can start early enough, it can be an iterative process, right? You show somebody the summary statement, you show the introduction, and you say, do you think this is going to fly? Or do you think they're going to kill me? Right? Right? And then you keep going that way till you get to the point where you and some of your colleagues are happy with it, right? And there's still no guarantees, because if you get additional reviewers that haven't seen it before, they might add something new, right? But that's kind of how I've approached it in the past, if that helps.
Yeah, I agree with Tom. I think it's really important to talk to the program officer, because they can, if they were at study section, they can give you a sense. Is everybody concerned about this, or just one person and they wrote a whole lot?
Yeah, one of the things I've done in the past too is you're absolutely right, Derek. It's almost impossible to put everything into the introduction, but I've actually weaved in some of the comments and addressed some of the other comments in the actual body of the grant proposal, and that way you can get everybody's comments addressed. But I agree. I mean, you have to get the most important ones in that one-page introduction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sterling, you had a question?
Yes. Hi, Tom. Hi, Tom. Thanks for doing this. Your suggestion on using the logistics and costs to address concerns brought up an issue I had with my KO1 submission, where the reviewer said it was underpowered. And he was right, because the power study said I needed to have like 100 samples, but for this KO1, because of my budget, I put only 30 samples. Is that a fair way to address it, or would you have a better way to?
So I'd have to see exactly what they said, but what you probably want to do is go ahead and tell them you're going to run as many samples as you can afford to run to boost the power, and then try to hit that target. The other thing you can do is go back to your original design, and if you can change the design to increase your power, try to change the design to increase the power, because depending on where you're getting the samples from and how the design is set up, that can be almost a free way to do it without it necessarily costing you anything extra, right? And if you can reconfigure the experimental design to improve your power, then it could be more affordable to give them what they want. And say, hey, look, I appreciate what you wanted me to do. Only Jeff Bezos could afford to run the study you guys suggested. My name's not Jeff, so I changed the experimental design and tried to align the budget with the actual funding mechanism, right? Or
Yeah.
words to that effect, right?
Well, and that's what I said. I'm trying to gather preliminary data so that I can put it into my R1 application that has a bigger budget. But it sounds like redesigning plan might be another nice way of
Yeah.
fixing.
Yeah, so when I said aggression versus supplication, this is one of those things where if somebody says something that really isn't fair, that can give you an opportunity to push back, but you have to do it in a reasonable way that won't potentially turn the rest of the reviewers against you.
Gotcha.
And so in this situation, you can remind them, look, this is a K award, right?
By the way,
This isn't a R01, right? And so, you know, I've addressed your concerns within the confines of the sounding mechanism by increasing the sample size and adjusting the experimental design to maximize power, right?
Okay, cool. Thank you.
yeah, Sterling, I had somebody who unfortunately had bad advice. She went in with a K99 and because of her power calculation, her mentor said, oh, don't worry about the budget. Just put in, for, you know, to have enough power. And they sent it back not discussed because she was way over budget. And so, you know, the biggest thing we did, we actually went from not discussed to funded, but we just paired. I said, who told you that? So, you know, sometimes even whatever the power is, you still have to say, look, this is the budget we got, especially when you're talking K awards where the budgets are small.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? No? Okay.
I think this is the third time I've done this, so, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing I want to let people know, there's a new thing that you can actually adjust your initial scores during the read phase. They just started this in study section. What that means is if you gave a 6 and you get to the read phase and you see the other 2 reviewers gave it a 1 or vice versa, you might want to change. You might say, oh, well, that was a good point they made. And that will make it easier for things to be either above or below the cutoff instead of kind of having these very disparate scores. So this is something most people had not heard of. I'm on study section in a couple of weeks, and that was something they said there is new. They're starting. FYI. All right. Well, thanks everybody.
One thing I forgot to say, I was
Oh.
going to say, if you're going to ask somebody for letters or to read stuff, you definitely want to at least try to come in, you know, more than a couple of weeks before to give the people a chance to look at the stuff for you rather than trying to drop everything that night before and do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's it.
Or my favorite is someone asked me to read their grant on Mardi Gras Day.
Yeah, not that either.
Usually you're kind of busy on Mardi Gras Day with something. All right, thanks everybody. And our next month, we're gonna have Paula and Meredith telling you how to find funding. Everybody wants to find that unusual funding. Let's go looking. So talk to you later. Thanks.